Welcome, everyone, to the Public Humanities Hub Public Scholarship Speaker Series, co-hosted with the University of Victoria's Visual Storytelling and Graphic Art in Genocide and Human Rights Education. I'm Andrea Webb, the co-director of the project and a faculty member in the Faculty of Education at UBC. With my colleague, Matt Hukulak, we are moderating today's discussion. We want to begin by acknowledging that UBC is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people, land on which we are uninvited guests. We are grateful to be able to do this work here, and because today's panel is virtual, we invite attendees to acknowledge the territories in which they are joining us from today. Today's event features my friend and colleague, Shannon Leddy, from the Faculty of Education at UBC. It is the third in a series of 6 about the ethics of trauma-informed research that the Hub and UVic are co-sponsoring this year. So before we get started, I'd like to tell you about the other 2. On July 6th, George Beliveau and Christina Cook will be sharing their work on trauma-informed research with survivors. And on November 2nd, Shell Anderson will join us to talk about the human rights approaches to witnessing and testimony gathering. Finally, we are still working on scheduling for the Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma presentation, but please check back to the Public Humanities Hub website for more information. We hope that you can join us for one or all of these events. And I'll now hand it over to Matt to introduce himself.
Good morning or good evening, wherever you may be. I would like to acknowledge that I'm situated on the traditional territories of the Legungun peoples, on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I'm sitting in the University of Victoria Libraries, which is on a flat land, which I'm told was a camas field before our library was built, where local communities would gather, share knowledge, and nourish one another. We hope that this series is equally nourishing for you in that spirit. This has been an interdisciplinary discussion about trauma-informed research. And Dr. Leddy, I'd like to start off with one of our major questions is where you are and where you sit, how do you define trauma-informed research? And before you answer that, did I completely jump the introduction, Andy?
No.
All right, perfect.
But you might want to let Shannon introduce herself.
Yes, that's what I meant. Shannon, my apologies. Please
Smooth like glass. We're doing very well. It's all good.
Already.
Okay. Hello, my friends. Tawao, Nimiwetan, pardon me. Nimiwetan Ewa Pamitan. It's good to see you here today. Shannon Leddy Nitsika-san. My name is Dr. Shannon Leddy. I am a faculty member and a colleague and a friend of Andrea Webb's in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy at UBC, and I'm a member of the Métis Nation. I'm originally from Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon. I've been an uninvited guest on the traditional and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people since 1994. And today I'm speaking to you from the traditional homeland of the Danish people. So it's actually 6 in the evening here, and I'm way more awake than you guys. Pretty sure. But I'm really delighted to be asked to speak about this today. And to your question, Matt, thank you. I think my work has actually so far been more involved with trauma-informed pedagogy than it has been with trauma-informed research. But thinking about what that means sort of requires us to consider that most people in the world, most people that we encounter on a daily basis will have experienced some form of trauma in their lifetime and may have a variety of triggers, and their responses may be from fairly minor and unnoticeable to quite substantial and sort of quite trauma-induced reactions. And I think beyond that, we may think about trauma as being both personal experiences, but we may also think about trauma as being cultural experiences. Linda Smith, along with Leonie Pihama, who are both Maori researchers, have discussed the fact that for Indigenous peoples, trauma can actually be the result of multiple generations and iterations of colonial genocide, colonial policies, things, racism, oppression, and systemic assaults, a succession of systemic assaults. So I think we need to think about trauma in a couple of different ways as either those personal or cultural experiences, and people may come with compound trauma. And so when it comes to research and when it comes to thinking about how we teach, we have to consider those factors when we design our research methodologies. I think it's always best to make sure that we're working with our research participants, that we're co-designing research strategies, that we are ensuring that our questions are relevant, that our questions are not intrusive, that we are aware of the possible trauma responses that people may exhibit. And this is true of our students in classes as well. And we have to be responsive to that, and we have to allow people to feel what they feel. And I think to prevent re-traumatizing, we need to hold space for them. But that takes a lot of emotional energy, but I think that's something that has been missing in Western academic research for quite a long time, where we felt like we could maybe turn people into numbers or just look at a person's knee when really it's connected to all of the other bits. And so, we have to look at people holistically. So yeah, that I think is my response to that startup question.
And it's so interesting because I think that it highlights the way that none of these things are done in isolation, right? So that we are, if we are doing research and then we are thinking about how we take that research, which is generally in the public good, and make it public and share with people, we have to be thinking about the pedagogy part of that as well. And it's not just, we extract information and then we hold that information. There has to be some sort of element of making it public, dissemination, sharing, knowledge mobilization, whatever terminology people are currently using, but that none of those things are done purely for the research side of it, right? It's all done to be in the public good. So when you think about your own work in many different areas as it relates to both the trauma-informed pedagogy and the flip side of that, or the connected piece of that trauma-informed research, how do you start to think about the knowledge mobilization and this idea of being in the public good as part of what you do?
That's a really good question. And I think particularly coming from teacher education, I feel like my work is directly linked to the public good. Who do we want to be teachers? What are the qualities that we need our teachers to have in the classroom? What spirit do we want them to nurture in students who are going to be our peers, our colleagues, our neighbors, our pharmacists, or what have yous in the future? So how do we do that work in a good way? And I think for me in my work, I use a lot of circle pedagogy. So we do a lot of, moving the desks aside, sort of decolonizing the classroom space to come into a circle where we are sharing with one another. And I think, your question also sort of reminded me of the idea of safe space as one of the pedagogical strategies. And I actually lean away from safe space more to the notion of brave space, because I think the idea of a safe space conflates safety with honesty, or with our students' emotional responses, and we really can't control those things. So I think part of public pedagogy is being responsible for our words, being responsible for the stories that I tell, or that we tell rather, and being understanding how to respond to those reactions, how to be responsive when our words do hit those trauma chords, when they do cause people to withdraw, or there's upset and concern. How do we navigate those spaces? Because there is no way to have honest and meaningful public discourse without some disagreement and some upset. So how do we do that work in loving ways that call people in rather than calling people out?
I have learning from you, I have adopted this idea of the brave space as being part of the conversations I have with students in my own area, which is social studies, and often very difficult topics and really uncomfortable, often very personally laden questions or challenges. And so I think, that this is something that really resonates with people, is this idea of entering a space bravely, but with compassion, and with a positive mindset, to learn from each other. And I think that sort of, sets back to this idea of the positionality, which is, one of the pillars of these conversations, is how do we position ourselves as both knowledgeable and learners when we engage in this work. So how do you think about yourself as both, a knowledge holder, but also a learner when it comes to trauma-informed pedagogies or research?
I have two key strategies that I start every single course that I teach with. And the first is to say that I can't teach you anything. And that is not to say that I don't know anything, but it is to say that, learning is a two-way street, and I'm not a banking style educator where I'm just going to pour information into your head. This work is about you doing some of the thinking. And the second thing I say is that I will probably offend you at some point. I will have no intention of offending you, but somehow, sometime, it's probably going to happen and not how you expect. So, if that does happen, let me know. And I know who I am. I know what my flaws are, and I'm quite happy to work through, whatever it is that happened that caused some consternation. So I think those are really important approaches in terms of teaching work. I think in terms of research work, a lot of what we need to do is to think about the ways in which we must decolonize ourselves. And I'll show you a little bit later on in our conversation the strategy that I use that has to do with Indigenous art. But it really involves examining our assumptions about Indigenous people, trying to trace where our assumptions might have come from, those sort of colonial mythologies and received wisdom about what it means to be Canadian or who Indigenous people are within that context. It means beginning to dismantle pan-Indigenous notions or the mythology that Indigenous peoples are monoliths, and to learn about specific cultures and how they vary in various regions across Canada. And I think, that's work that teachers have to do as well. But I think for for researchers, speaking of positionality, we don't always necessarily think about, we think about, who we are as researchers, but I think the bigger the conversation gets globally, the more important it is for us to really own ourselves and to be fine with who you are, fine with whatever background you're coming from, but to own it going into the research and be aware that can be more informing of how you're thinking than maybe you take into account.
Shannon, I want to follow up on that with hopefully a well-conceived question here, but forgive me because I do feel clumsy. You really touched me when you said we are all bringing our own traumas to this teaching or research experience. And that's the first time I've actually heard that articulated so clearly. And just in my personal life, I'm almost 50 and having these wonderful conversations with my grandmother and realizing the historical traumas of the family that were just never spoken of, right? It's almost like in my culture growing up, that trauma had to be repressed, and that was the expectation. Mm-hmm. There's so many people like me teaching right now. And if I'm coming to this classroom with that repressed trauma, what type of work can someone like me do in that classroom who has traditionally never dealt with that trauma, never had language to deal with that trauma, and then being able to do that in a way so I can be a more effective teacher to the students who have experienced trauma? Does that make sense as a question? Like what experiences have you had? What have you learned about that positionality of the teacher in this environment in dealing with their own trauma first in order to reach the students?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Matt. Well, I mean, I'm personally a trauma-free zone. I don't know about the rest of y'all. No, that is absolutely true. Like we are fragile beings, and we all want to do our best. And sometimes I think that's really actually an important point. Like if we haven't dealt with our own trauma, with our own drama, with our own histories, probably working it out right in front of the classroom. I'm thinking of when I was a high school teacher, for example, you might want to start before that. And I think it does have to do with those questions. For me, this is why art is the biggest influence in my life and in my work, that I think reading novels, looking at paintings, watching films, listening to music, engaging with the experiences of people from my own Métis culture and other Indigenous cultures across Canada, but also, Black filmmakers, Asian filmmakers, like hearing and learning these stories, seeing through the eyes of others is what helps us understand reality in a different way. And often that can touch us and remind us of what we might need to deal with, or how, and as a young person approaching 50, like I think it compounds as we go through the years. And your grandmother can probably tell you that she's, my grandmother, she lived to 103, and at 94 she told me she was still learning every day. I think she stopped shortly after that, but so I think we really do keep going with all of this work. And I think it is about engaging with materials that kind of give us oblique angles on our own experiences, because sometimes it's hard to trot those traumas out, and it's hard to be honest with ourselves. And I think you can re-traumatize yourself if you're not doing that in a supportive way, or with a community of, or someone at least that you can go to and say, I just read this novel and it really got me. You need someone to hold you so that you're not re-traumatized. But yeah, I find art to be one of the most powerful ways to begin to undertake that work. And then ideally, as teachers and researchers, we carry on with finding out what else we need to know, because then we're better able to identify it and, identify trauma reactions in our students. It doesn't have to be a PTSD reaction. It can be something just even withdrawing and, having to sort of help someone learn how to human through those reactions and still feel included in your class, in your work, and in whatever you're doing together.
Which I think is a lovely segue into sort of this topic of interdisciplinarity. We are obviously working with the Public Humanities Hub, and the purpose of the Public Humanities Hub is to bring those topics into conversation with each other. So, you've talked a little bit about the fields that you draw on as part of the interdisciplinarity of your work. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that. And in some cases, if you are drawing on, some fairly traditional backgrounds, how do you decolonize those? How do you make those relevant, specifically when you're talking about these intergenerational cultural traumas, as well as the personal traumas?
Thank you, Andrea. That is a really good question. I think so. To go to the first part of the question, what are the disciplinary areas that I draw from? My background is in art history, and I'm also a practicing visual artist and a writer. And I'm learning how to make films actually now. So it's always something new, right? But so that's a huge key in the work that I do. And then of course there's Indigenous education and pedagogies. And I'm someone that found my father and his family later on in my life. So I have been engaged in Indigenous learning through friends and community all throughout my youth. But now that I have a family and a nation that claims me, that's made a difference. And it's actually, the older you get, the easier it is to learn in some ways, because now you have some place to hang that learning, right? When you're young, you're a sponge, but then everything is on these little pockets and you can't see how they're connected. So now I'm better able to make the connections. And then the third area that I think a lot about in my work is sort of eco-pedagogy, thinking about the land as a teacher, thinking about the land as medicine. I am really fortunate to be doing some work with Dr. Rita Irwin right now that is going to be about, walking on the land in multiple seasons and these sort of recursions into the same places, and really attuning ourselves to this one place that is our home and that we share. It's not just, it's not our land. I think we belong to the land. So how do we fit that into pedagogy? And in all of that, Andrea, I have forgotten the second part of the question.
Well, I think that, in some cases when you talk about things like drawing on art, and the visual art and even narrative writing, film, how do we decolonize those, or how do you engage with decolonization of these beautiful things that have really often also become quite strong cultural markers and carriers, and is there a resistance in the way that you're engaging with it? Is it about twisting, breaking, changing in a way that sort of helps to hold it up for examination when we are working with people who perhaps are traumatized and have engaged in intergenerational cultural trauma, of which this art could be seen as a trigger?
That's a really good question, and I think I'm going to try to give two answers, although I may forget the second one again by the time we get there. So we'll do our best. But I think the first answer has to do with, I was accidentally an English teacher when I was a high school teacher for a while. And so, having taken one university English course, it was a natural fit. But, I did a lot of learning about story arcs and plots and all of those kinds of things, and like things that I had learned in school. And it realized as we're learning that, we're teaching students this one way of thinking about what a story is, as though there is no other way of thinking about what a story is, and that it's always going to have this beginning and middle and end. And I think, particularly in the last number of decades, we've seen examples of say, Hollywood and other cinematic storytelling that play with that structure a little bit, and that come closer to maybe some Indigenous ways of storytelling, where there isn't necessarily a beginning and middle and end. And I think the other thing that's really important about that is our notion of time. And particularly when we think about traditional stories, I was just writing something the other day about, a long time ago when Coyote lost his bone needle, yesterday or tomorrow or 78 years from now, so also playing with notions of linear time, that all time is now, and that's another, way of thinking that is very convenient in the Western world, helps me show up for things on time, but it also is, not necessarily how things go. And if we think about the seasons and the cycles and even, recursive opportunities into stories. When you hear a story for the first time, you take something away from it. If you have the opportunity to hear it again, the meaning builds and builds and builds again over time. And I think that's another thing that we don't necessarily talk about. Well, I didn't talk about it as a high school English teacher. Maybe the qualified ones did. But, I think that's a really important part of how I work with stories in my classroom, that traumatizing element too. I'm always willing to have students self-identify and leave the room, or just be quiet and leave the room. I don't insist that people stay. I don't necessarily give trigger warnings other than, here's the context of what we're going to see, here's what might come up. But I feel like, particularly if we're dealing with stories of traumatization, the characters, the real people that we're talking about did not get trigger warnings in their lives. Yes. About what was going to happen to them. So I think, and that's part of that brave space, that we need to bear witness. We need to be responsible and care for ourselves. We can't just, open it and give it all and bleed all over the place. But we do have to do some of that work. Yeah. And I think that, another element of this is modeling. What kinds of stories am I willing to share? How do I share them? What kind of care do I build in the classroom community or in the research community, and how do we work together on this?
Yeah. And I think about this so much in the context of the narratives of testimony that survivors of genocide give and share with us, right? And we are all involved in these conversations around survivor stories, and some stories have become or some survivors are very good at giving their narratives and their story because they've done it. When I think about the Holocaust survivors, who are astute at this kind of conversation. And then I think about testimony giving that is part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and how very raw and almost this is the first time I'm saying this out loud, that becomes part of the narratives that we also are hearing. And I think that it's quite profound when you talk about the fact that, none of those survivors were given the trigger warnings of the things that are about to happen to them.
Yeah.
And so, that is very much part of it. But there's not only us rehearing stories, but there's also them re-giving stories. And I think about how those testimonies, and I think testimony is actually a really important word to be using there. They also refine and change those stories, narratives, testimonies, as they go through the number of tellings that are part of their own experience as well. And how that is both traumatizing, but also calcifying, as they go through that process too.
Yeah, I think, it occurs to me that there are sort of two things at play here. The first being the risk of re-traumatizing survivors who are telling their stories. There are absolutely those people who are very adept at sharing, who have done enough healing work that they're able to, for the most part, get some distance and understand why it's so important for them to keep sharing their story. But we still have to care for them spiritually. And I think particularly like the Turtle Island cluster is working with the Indian Residential School Center for Dialogue on ensuring that we have spiritual and cultural protocols in place. But I think the other thing, particularly for us as researchers, is the risk of vicarious trauma. Where we are hearing these stories that, which you sort of referred to earlier, Matt, might trigger our own memories and trauma, or may just be, something that is so painful and horrifying to hear for the first time that you can't easily shake it. So I think, for ourselves too, whether I'm a person that engages in some ceremony in terms of smudging and prayerfulness and laying down tobacco and honoring some of those traditions. And I think we all need to have some kind of practice like that, even if it's going for a walk, spending time in the garden. We really need to care for ourselves as researchers and educators, especially when we're doing this really difficult soul work. I don't know if that answered your question, Andrea.
No, it's not really a question. It's more just this conversation, I think, and it's so important in terms of how we engage in this also. And I think that is when we talk about this idea of trauma-informed research, we often are, again, thinking with and for and holding up our participants. But you have really highlighted what is so important in terms of ourselves being situated in the work as well. And, I have in the past spent a lot of time listening to Holocaust testimony, and you can't do that for a full day's work every day and then, turn around and go out into the world and feel safe. Yeah, exactly. Right. And I think, you've highlighted that there has to be this balance in terms of care for others and care for self, as part of that conversation. Sorry. Thanks, Matt.
Well, I just wanted to say that those were such beautiful answers. And again, I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable here, so forgive me. But a part of our training here at UVic is the Indigenous acumen training. And there is a constant call to decolonize the space. And hearing you speak today was the first time it occurred to me that my own trauma work is necessary in that decolonization process. Right? That if I am teaching Indigenous students, that I need to be doing my own work and that I am a participant in this. Because again, within my own tradition of grad school, becoming an English major, et cetera, there is no space made for that work. In fact, you repress it and we reify the work of art so that there is no emotion in many cases, or it's always an intellectual engagement with the history of, or the creation of, but never me and that work. right?
Mhm.
So hearing you speak today, as it's been a number of epiphanies of what that means in the local context of decolonization and how to be a better pedagogue in this environment. So I don't have a question. I just wanted to say that. So thank you.
I appreciate that, Matt, and it, just reminds me of the whole, when you travel, then they're giving the safety thing. You have to put your own mask on before you can put somebody else's mask on. And we used to, with the little kids in elementary school too, you talk about filling up your bucket and making sure your own bucket is full before you can fill up someone else's bucket. So I think that work is important. And I think it's particularly important for those of us who are working with genocide survivors, with Indigenous peoples, because one of the things that we do, and you sort of touched on it, is that we hold other people up. We're lifting other people up. So the stories that we're telling through this visual storytelling research are about opportunities for survivors to represent themselves and their own histories that in a way that moves away from colonial textbooks and messaging that is really about the survivor's voice being highlighted, and that so we really need communities of care to do this work, I think. I wonder if this is a good opportunity to sort of, I have 3 slides that I thought I would share with you.
Yeah,
So
that's awesome.
maybe I will do that. You're going to see my messy background here, I think. And then we'll do that. Okay, so here are some, so there's 2 key concepts, and there are multiple sort of frameworks that I use in the classroom. But I really encourage my students to understand both themselves and their students as holistic people. And in this set of, in the medicine wheel teachings, and these are available, I use this specific set of teachings because it comes from a book called The Sacred Tree, which was compiled after a meeting of elders in the 1980s. So it's being sort of vetted by multiple elders, and it's widely available, so it's easy to access. But the idea of the medicine wheel in these teachings is that each of the quadrants represents one aspect of our humanity: our intellectual selves, our spiritual selves, our emotional selves, and our physical selves. And I challenge my students and myself to think about, what would it mean if we thought that way in the classroom? If we thought about ourselves as teachers, how long can you sit at a desk drinking coffee without moving and marking papers before you actually just want to die? So what part of yourself are you not honoring in that work? And if you are doing that work, what does your classroom look like for your students? I remember going to see some kindergartners last year. I took my drum and sang them some songs, and I thought they were going to be on the carpet, but they were on the desks. Well, you've never seen such wiggly humans in your lives. Like, how were they supposed to sit there? I'm drumming, you should be moving, but they had to, stay contained. So, so I think that's a really important thing to consider. And then from our Anishinaabe cousins, I love the 7 sacred teachings: love, honesty, humility, respect, truth, courage, and wisdom. And that question comes up again. What would it mean if you planned your lessons, if you planned your research, if you planned your day with those values in mind? How would that manifest in your life, in your work with your students, in your students' lives, and so on? So I think those are some big frameworks. And then, having spoken a little bit about art, I just wanted to share with you and invite you into the process of phenomenological art inquiry. So I love working with contemporary political and identity-based art by Indigenous people. This is a fairly recent painting by Kent Monkman called The Scoop, and he paints massive canvases. And so to take a person, and it was predicated on the idea that on average, a person spends 30 seconds looking at a work of art in an art gallery. And, if we think about how long it must take to paint a canvas that is nearly 1 meter by 1.25 meters, 30 seconds is not a huge amount of time. So how do we slow ourselves down? And what is it that we're trying to do when we work with art? And I sort of referred to earlier the idea that art provides an opportunity for us to see through the eyes of another. So it's the opportunity for a dialogic engagement where everything that we are, everything that we know, everything we've experienced arrives with us at the moment that we see a work of art. And the artist that's left whatever they have left for us, whether it's a sculpture or a canvas, has also brought everything they know they are and that they've experienced to that work. So now we have this interface where we can sort of, begin to understand one another and see through one another's eyes. So to sort of organize that extremely unwieldy and ephemeral process, I have these 5 guiding questions. So the softball question of what do I see? Well, it's a painting, right? So it's not a running shoe, it's not a TP, it's a painting. Super easy, we got this. A key aspect of this work is that there are no wrong answers. This is interpretation without a master. So I'm going to invite, I don't know that anyone can pop up in the chat. I think maybe the chat is disabled, but maybe the panelists would indulge me in saying, what associations does this bring up for you?
It's so conflicting. It's so challenging. I mean, as somebody who is, my area of research up to this point has been Canadian history, right? So I look at the Red Surge, and that is, they often in texts reified individual. It's so challenging, especially when you think about your assumptions in a particular way.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about what is the typical image that we see of the idea of residential school, it's usually little kids in rows with the same haircut. So this is a completely violent departure from, how the story is still being fed to us. And, is there anything that you like about this painting?
For me, it's the 2 children in the background running
Yeah.
into the field, as well as I believe it may be a wolf in the back as well, like this witness, this presence there. That's for me is where the hope is in this drama.
And I have to say, I love the image of there's a mother and child in front of the tree, and it's almost like a pietà.
Yes. Yeah.
It is a very beatific face on the mother.
Yeah. See, and that's so lovely. And this is why it's so much fun to do this work in a group, because we are drawn to different things. So there's the hopefulness, but there's also the artfulness and the associations with other work that is evocative to us. If I ask you what makes you uncomfortable about this work.
Yes.
That's hard to answer, isn't it?
Yeah. And I'm an immigrant to this country, and at the ceremony for my citizenship, I took a picture with a Mountie, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm from the United States, and Canada is represented by the Mountie. I think Paul Gross was in a comedy where he plays a Mountie in Chicago working with the Americans. So for me, the Mountie has always been this, righteous, good, upstanding, do right.
Dudley do right, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So to see the Mounties here working in conjunction with the Catholic Church, these pale faces of death almost, no one's smiling. So this is upending, years of indoctrination in my life, even as a non-Canadian.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, and I think, I've had students, when I've shown this image in class or similar images, have reactions because they had RCMP family members. And so it's that same sort of disruption, or clergy family members. And these are the folks that we are taught to think of as helpers. So when we see this kind of scenario, and even, fictionalized scenario from Monkman's imagination, it certainly describes something that happened, and very possibly in this way. So, and that leaning into the what makes me uncomfortable question, you articulated it beautifully, Matt. It asks us to question our assumptions, our understandings, about Indigenous people, where some of our, or even about, RCMP or clergy, where do some of our ideas come from? So it's the opportunity to examine. And it's easy if you're in a gallery, you just think, I don't like it, and you keep moving, and we don't do that work. But when we are invited to dwell, then things can emerge. And the other thing is that it can be our own dialogue, or it can be with your best friends. So you're not exposing yourself, you're not, taking huge risks, but you're sort of wading into the water. And then the last question, what do I need to learn? I mean, people often, it matters that Kent Monkman is a member of the Cree Nation. It matters that Lawrence Paul Yakwalupton is, from the Northwest Coast, and those things matter. So, because that also begins to unpack our pan-Indigenous ideas, it leads to other sorts of learning. So following up with ourselves and doing some of the research that can keep that decolonizing work going, that is really just about coming to grips with, truth and reconciliation. We're learning the truth about the things that happened in Canada historically, due to colonization, due to the very notion of Canada itself. But we also have to come to grips with where we are in all of that. When we arrive, what is our family arrival story? My mother is second generation Irish Canadian. Or maybe I am. One of us is second generation Irish Canadian. So there is an arrival story that sort of sits alongside the Métis side of the story, and how, we all have to navigate those things. So this just to me seems like a great art. Opens doors, it opens our minds, it opens our mouths. And then the last slide, just to reiterate those 7 sacred teachings. I think that can't that never leaves my mind, to think about what it means to behave in those ways. And I always think it's interesting to juxtapose the 7 deadly sins from Christianity with the 7 sacred teachings. There's the don'ts, and then the do's, and thinking pedagogically, what's more like honey, what's going to catch you more flies. And then finally, I love the concept of Akotawin, which is the interrelatedness of all living things and beings and natural elements and ideas with the world. So when I do my work, I'm not just thinking of people. I'm thinking of, the more than human world, the water, the land, the rocks. It's been really interesting to be in a different country for more than 2 weeks, to think about, before we began the seminar, I was talking about, they have lilacs in Denmark. I'm really excited because I wasn't sure they would. And they've got wild roses, and they've got, so the land is in many ways the same, but it's different. And how do we develop a relationship with that? And how do we encourage that in our students? How do we honor that in our work as researchers and as educators? Ekosi, I'm going to stop sharing now. But I can keep talking if you guys are.
No, sorry. I was having trouble with my mute. I apologize. So I think, I guess my last question before we open questions to the panel is, so what does reconciliation look like? You talked about decolonization. We've talked about truth. What does reconciliation look like as part of your work, or aspirationally, what you hope that your pedagogy and research will lead to with reconciliation?
I think that's a great question. And I'm quite conscious, well, not always conscious, but I try to be very conscious of thinking about reconciling and decolonizing, to keep them and indigenizing, to keep those words in their verb form, to keep them active, to keep reminding ourselves that the work isn't done. So I think for me, reconciling means just to keep on the road, to keep doing the work, to keep walking, to keep telling the truth, to keep inviting people in to it doesn't stop. And I know that there are many Indigenous people and Indigenous scholars in particular who object to the word reconciliation, who don't believe that it will happen in their lifetimes, who feel like it's become a throwaway word. And I, in some ways I agree. And that's why I think the verb form might be the more powerful way of thinking about it, because it's never done. Decolonizing is never done. Reconciling is never done. Indigenizing is never done. It's part of how we need to learn to live together.
Mm-hmm. And as soon as we become static, then it becomes like tacit. We don't think about it. We're not active. We're not engaged. We're off to something else.
Exactly.
rather than in that moment.
Yeah.
Shannon, I think that speaks to what you talked about earlier about Indigenous time, right?
Mhm.
You mentioned the 7 deadly sins, and if we think in that worldview, there's a revelation coming where everything gets wrapped up, all done, we're great, fine,
Yeah.
versus this continuing now and that active verb form where it's living together, always,
Mhm.
not with this specific end goal in mind, or if the end goal is reconciliation, perhaps a recognition that that work will never end. So to sort of leave that at the door when you're coming in, to recognize that this is a continuous process.
Absolutely. And you make me think of Leroy Littlebear, who talks about the relationship between quantum physics and Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies. And I think, yeah, on a quantum level too, it's that intentionality of continuing to do the work that we create the world in our speaking. We create our paths and our walking. And so to consciously know that we have to do that work is to make things better, even with the intention, right? And I think that's important.
So at this point, we'd like to transition to the questions from the audience. So there is a first question. We also invite the audience to please submit your questions through the portal if you have any. But the first question has come in. It says, when you teach in the B.Ed program, how do you engage with the formal or prescribed BC curriculum in decolonizing ways, or at least challenge the assumptions embedded in the curriculum?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I teach, I'm the coordinator for the course, the required course in Indigenous education in the B.Ed program. And one of the things that I think about a lot is that one of the most colonized things about schools is, well, it's schools. We have these buildings and we have these rows of desks and we have these, now you're doing math, now you're doing science, now you're doing PE, now you're doing, what have you. And we don't live in the world in those ways. So I'm constantly trying to encourage pre-service teachers to think more in more interdisciplinary ways. If you've heard me speak before, I'm so sorry because I always give the birthday party example. But when I do when I think about a birthday party, I'm sending out I'm making a list of people I want to invite. I'm finding out if they're going to die of shellfish allergies. So I'm setting my menu. I'm decorating, I'm shopping, I'm baking, all of these things. We're singing a song at some point. I'm covering every single area of the curriculum. But at no point will I say, well, I might now because I think it would be funny. I can't talk to you about anything but chemistry right now because I'm putting baking powder into my cake batter. So we're only doing chemistry. We don't live in the world in these ways. So I think to begin to understand how what we are teaching is related to the lives we are trying to prepare our students for, that's really important. And I think there are all kinds of ways of getting around curricular strictures to dance the way we know it needs to be danced with our students. I love IRPs, they're fantastic. But I think we also have to think sensibly for ourselves. And the other thing I think that is really important about decolonizing curriculum, and it's related, is that we're teaching students. We're not teaching subjects, we're teaching human beings. So when we ensure that our work is student-centered, that it's inquiry-based, that we are allowing them to prove their learning, not in the ways that we insist on, but in the ways that show us how they shine, then we're decolonizing the curriculum. Then we're doing really human work. And I think that's really all, well, it's not really all decolonizing curriculum, but it's at the heart of making space for other ways of thinking and knowing and being.
I have a question as we wait for other questions coming in. My first question was about how can I as a teacher work with material. One thing I hear from colleagues now, and particularly older colleagues like myself, is students are changing. Students have changed. And there's a worry in the classroom. I don't know if you've experienced this, but particularly in the university classroom. And there seems to be a disconnect between how we were trained and the expectations of the student. And you touched on this when you mentioned not safe spaces, but brave spaces. I want to follow up on that. And how can we cultivate braver spaces, both in the university classroom and high school classrooms, or in what I grew up calling the grade school classroom?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, I just return to the idea of circle pedagogy, that when we, and it is, you don't have to follow any kind of traditional protocol, but to sit, other than when we're sitting in a circle, only the person who is the speaker gets to speak. And, often that's why a talking stick or some kind of talking object is passed around. I think that's a significantly democratizing force. In our classroom, it puts us on the same level. I often remind students when we're doing this work that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, that, you listen twice as much as you speak, and that listening doesn't mean thinking about how you're going to rebut what the other person says. It means actually hearing what they're saying, that you have 1 job. If you're not speaking, you have 1 job. And I think that kind of deformalization too of the classroom space, that makes it more about us, not me. I often say, this is our class. It's not my class, it's our class. So I think that's one strategy. And then I think secondarily, being very conscious, and this is definitely harder in high school classrooms and elementary classrooms than it is in university classrooms, but ensuring that we have curricular materials, resources that are developed by not just Indigenous people, but other, Black people and people of color, that we're inviting multiple voices into the classroom, that we are exposing ourselves and our students to multiple ways of thinking and being in the world, that we take on the difficult topics. I mean, it's great to talk about Shakespeare, but what are students experiencing in their lives? What is happening in their homes? What are they seeing on the YouTubes, and TikTok and all of that? Like how much opportunity do they have in their homes to talk with their parents about the things, or their family or their carers about the things that they're seeing and experiencing? So, I think that's a really big part of the work, that we're not just teaching, but we're raising people. And even when it comes to post-secondary institutions, we're still raising people. So that might have been a bit of an oblique answer, but I hope it worked out. Excellent.
Absolutely.
Well, it's a quiet group tonight. It's okay if no one has questions. I know I gave all of the answers, so and they will be on the test at the end, so you can put your answers in the chat.
Shannon, you showed Monk's work.
Mm-hmm.
Do you do any type of art engagement where students themselves or you yourself are in an art creation situation, and how has that worked for you if you've done that?
I love it so much. Well, I was trained to be an art, or educated, I should say, to be an art and social studies teacher. And so for years, while I was a high school teacher, I taught art, and I'm sort of the jack of all trades kind of art maker. Like, I like to do everything. I don't do anything particularly well, but I like to be able to do it all. So in the grad class that I teach, Indigenous Visual Expressionist Pedagogy, I do an online version, but in the face-to-face version, every week, there is an opportunity to make art. So sometimes I teach them to crochet, or I'll teach them to weave. I always book the ceramic studio. We might do some painting or drawing or printmaking. And what I find, and it's because it was the same thing in a high school art classroom, you teach people how to do something, then you get them busy doing it, and their minds open and their ears open and their mouths open, and the conversations are deeper. And this is all rooted in the fact that I have ADD. So I often crochet during meetings, because if I don't, I'm distracting, or I distract myself. So it's there is research that backs up that when our hands are busy or we're making art, a lot of other things are happening. But it was born of my need to, like, I gotta fiddle with something while you guys are talking, because otherwise I'm gonna forget what we were doing or wander off. So yeah, I think it's so powerful to engage in some of those practices. And also, particularly because this is an art education class, to demonstrate the ways in which we can work with Indigenous art and artists in non-appropriative ways. So how can you, for example, in a recent class, I did a bunch of black and white copies of masks by Bo Dick, cut them into quarters, and then had students transfer them onto black sheets of cardstock with pastels. So they're not copying the whole thing, but they're doing something. And then we put them all together. And because they were black and white, everyone could do their own color. So you've got a way of learning from a master, learning about an Indigenous artist and culture, and then having an activity or a skill that creates something that's completely different, but inspired by and in honor of an Indigenous artist. So yeah, I know those practices are tremendously important to me. And just in the New York Times, I think it was yesterday or today, there was an article about the fact that making art is good for your mental health. I didn't read the article because the headline was like, yeah, check, good. But I'm sure that
Who needs to follow up with that?
I mean, I think I knew that kind of. So, but I'm sure, there is lots of good research that supports why it is important for us as humans to do that work.
Absolutely. I've recently rediscovered the joy of doodling, right?
Yeah.
Because my new iPad, I have a pen again, and I can just draw while I'm talking. And absolutely like you, I love the fact that I'm living in an age where language is coming into being about how I've experienced life, but couldn't really just like, ED, what does that mean to be someone with ED in a classroom?
Yeah.
You said something very interesting about, booking the ceramic studio. And I sort of want to take a step back in the few remaining moments that we have and think about the university and how siloed we are. And when you said I booked the ceramics lab, I thought, oh, wow, that would be so hard to do from, let's say, an English department, because that's in fine arts and that's their thing. And for traditional reasons, funding, bums and seats, et cetera, those silos remain. And I'm wondering, what does the university, like practically, what can it do at sort of those administrative levels in helping decolonize learning within our classrooms?
Oh boy.
You said softballs.
He just throws all the easy questions.
Yeah, like it was
right?
just in 3 minutes. Okay. Matt, we're so lucky because in the Faculty of Education, we have studio spaces in our building. So regardless of what discipline you're teaching, and we have these miraculous human beings, Kirsty Robbins and Fred. Definitely Fred. I'm sorry, Fred, I don't remember your last name. But they will help us book these spaces, and they take care of the lab spaces and supplies. Wouldn't it be miraculous if different faculties cooperated with one another to ensure that students were actually receiving a balanced education and opportunities? If you remember your first year of university when you thought you were going to be a fashion designer. Okay, that was me. No idea what else was out there, right? And it's only once you get in there and start, experimenting, do you find what you love or what you're good at or what's good for your soul. So I really wish that universities, departments, faculties would collaborate with one another. And, that's an interesting little bit of colonial thinking as well. Like, this is my territory and you can't come in and you didn't pay. And So, I think that's just where the decolonizing work has to continue. The reconciling work has to continue, that we need to learn to play nicely with one another and to let go of the notion of boundaries, of borders, of ownership, belonging. I mean, we're entitled to our things and ourselves and our autonomy, but why aren't we sharing resources? And what is it that we're saying about ourselves as human beings when we don't? That was under a minute. All right.
But I think that's so lovely in terms of summing up this idea that, of the public humanities and of these opportunities for interdisciplinary conversations. And just to make a little plug for us, but the place of education in that, right? That often the people in education you come from lots of different places, right? You come from art, you come from history, you come from literature. And we find ourselves in this this place where we often have to speak with people who have different disciplinary backgrounds and come from different levels of training or different areas of training. And that's where these conversations can be really generative. And hopefully we then start to spread out to the rest of the institution and break down some of those little silos that are so arbitrary and seem to be keeping folks apart rather than, you know, opportunities, sticky places where we can actually connect with each other on both sides of the tape.
Yeah.
One of the final, there's one question that's just come in, and I'll give this as the final question for the webinar is, you mentioned that one of your backgrounds is in art history. Would you comment on the challenges you have encountered?
Thank you for that question. I peeked at it too, so hi, Naomi. Thank you. When I started art history back in the early 90s, mid 90s, there were not a lot of people who were working on Indigenous arts as part of the canon of art history. So great, and Indigenous art in particular is informed not only by art history, but by anthropology as well. And so display practices come into consideration, aesthetic considerations and curatorial practices. But it was very hard to find supervisors at one point to do this work. And then it was very hard to find literature. I'm very, very pleased to say that as of 2023, there's a substantial body of and a growing body of literature on Indigenous artists, Indigenous curators writing about the importance of self-representation of the Indigenous the repatriation of authority over the way we represent ourselves and what we choose to show or not show, and how those things are visually produced for a public audience. So I'm sort of rushing through my answer with apologies, but I think those have been the key factors that have been challenges. Again, I'm pleased to say it's changing. Didn't write it to name. Okay.
Matt,
Cool.
do you have any final questions? And then I'll remind everybody about the upcoming ones.
I don't have any final questions, but I do have, I hope, not a final thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today. I have found this very informative, very introspective, outward focused. And if there's one thing I take from today is living in the verb, right?
Mm-hmm.
That continuous process of doing, of working together. So I thank you in particular for sharing these languages and these thoughts to form the wisdom that you've shared today. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. It was my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for being with us for this conversation today. Matt and I have had the distinct pleasure of being able to chat with a wide-ranging group of folks, and I am always so inspired and excited by these conversations where we get to see what people are up to, but also think about those connections and cross connections with the things that we also are interested in. And this has been such a wonderful opportunity to think about not only research, but where research goes when we start to think about who picks it up, who takes it up, how do teachers engage with this? How do educators, let's say educators writ large rather than just teachers, start to think about this? And I think it's so important to think about what Matt has highlighted, this idea of these actions rather than continuous actions, rather than terms that we throw around. So thank you to everybody who has been part of our conversation today. This was the third of a series of webinars around the ethics of trauma-informed research. Thank you again to Dr. Shannon Leddy for taking the time to have this conversation with us. We also have 3 additional sessions that will be coming up. We're taking a bit of a break through the month of June, and then our next session will be July 6th with Dr. George Beliveau and Christina Cook, who will be sharing their work on trauma-informed research and survivors, especially work with service personnel. Then November 2nd, Shell Anderson will be talking about human rights approaches to witnessing and testimony gathering. And then finally, we're still in the process of scheduling the Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma presentation. But please check the Public Humanities website for more information. Thank you again to the amazing folks from the Public Humanities Hub, Dylan, Heidi, and Sydney, and Jennifer, who is the project manager for our particular project, for all of their help getting these projects together and making these conversations happen. Thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we will see you in July.